good at doing that. So yeah, I was presuming you're filming.
I am.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah.
So just avoid the front. And then what we'll do is Lawrence is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll do a quick Q&A for 5 to 10 minutes at the end, if that's all right. Everyone ready? Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Thank you. Well, I'll try and do 20 minutes, but we'll see. Do I? Can you hear me? No. I need this then. Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. All right. So.
You can probably do this. You carry on with that and I'll get this.
Okay. I'm talking about, or the title is Food and Farming Choices for Health and Environment. And came up in the panel discussion about vegetarianism or beef eating and so on, and veganism and all of those issues for agriculture. So we'll get onto that as quickly as we can, but there's a background first of all. So whole health agriculture is a new initiative that's linking farmers, medical professionals, citizens to actually discuss and develop the idea of health. And we're talking about health, positive health, not health as absence of disease. You can't see any of this, so don't worry about it. And the ideas that we're promoting is that health is a process. That process can be managed, and that process can be transferred from the food into the animals, into the plants, into man, and it's part of the planet. So our position, our working hypothesis, is the idea that the health of soil, plant, animal, man, and the planet is one and indivisible. Not just linked together, but the health of our food, the health of our soil, means we have a healthy biodiversity, a healthy ecology, and a healthy planet. So that's the theory. And we also work on the assumption that health, if disease is infectious, so can health be. So we can create the quality, the dynamic of health, and that can be passed on through food and through the ecosystem. As someone said in the earlier panel, we are currently living our lives. The discussion was about climate change. I was focused on carbon, but my point is, if we just focus on carbon, we're in a cul-de-sac. The thing is more than carbon. There's a range of greenhouse gases that are described in terms of carbon equivalents, but we use the shorthand of carbon. And we lead into that cul-de-sac because we don't fully understand that. But the problem is much greater than that. We are living our lives as if we've got, I don't know, choose 10 planets, 6 planets, 3 planets, whatever. We, in the West, particularly aim to follow the North American, the US consumption model. And all the developing world and the development models are predicated on that. They try and follow that. And this is especially so in terms of diet. The consumption in the third world, in the global south, aims towards increase of the kinds of stuff that we in the West consume. So if we have a problem in terms of meat consumption, it's because meat consumption is increasing in places like China, massive increase. So we're consuming stuff. We only have one planet, and our entire planet, our entire system is based on this planet and on the limited ecology and finite resources around which the planet's built. Everything. All our stuff. You can just briefly see that. This is a tree, and on that tree is all our stuff, our houses, our cars, our dishwashers, everything we have on this very fragile tree. Everything we consume comes from a layer of soil, some water, everything which is natural resources, and the stuff below the ground, all of which is finite. We, unfortunately, are consuming these finite resources at an ever-expanding rate. This is called the Great Acceleration. You probably won't see it, but basically from 1950, the consumption of everything, all resources, shot up from 1950 onwards in this great acceleration, this great curve. There's not enough stuff. There's not enough resources. Climate change is only one symptom of this, because it's a consumption of air. but it's only one. We also have soil, we also have water. There's big debates about climate destruction and when is the tipping point. Big debates, and I'm not going to get into that. My view is we're perilously close to the tipping point where climate catastrophe, climate crisis, climate change is beyond recall. Some people say, well, we're not there yet, and we've got another 10 years or whatever. It doesn't matter. Let's not quibble about it. The fact is that we have to start making major changes now. We cannot delay. And there is a conspiracy of everyone, politicians certainly, businesses certainly, but also us as consumers and citizens. The conspiracy is not to recognise this. The conspiracy is we all convince ourselves we can carry on pretty much in the same old way. We can make a few modifications. We can cut down on meat, maybe, eat a little bit more vegetables. We can fiddle around a little bit with altering our travel habits and so on. When I say fiddle around, I'm not being derogatory about those things because they are critically important and we have to do them. But the major change will only come with manifest changes in our lifestyle and in our economic structures and our investment policies that go with that. You can't see it, but trust me, this is a thing that's just demonstrating it's not just climate change gases. The stuff that comes out of the earth, our natural resources, are at a point where they've reached the peak and are running out. We didn't get to the question in the panel this morning, but someone asked about the components that make up batteries and computers and the digital digital technology, the lithium, the rare earths, all of that kind of stuff. 30 years, 40 years. Within, possibly not my lifetime, but certainly within the lifetime of my children, this stuff will be used. As far as food and farming is concerned, we are facing probably 30 years at most of phosphorus, one of the key components that make our plants grow. Nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Nitrogen we can manufacture, or nitrogen, although that comes from oil, but we can have biologically fixed nitrogen. Phosphorus is from the ground, it's dug out. There's only one place in the world, North Africa, where we produce phosphorus. Phosphorus is mined. 30 years, optimistically, before that goes. We can't do anything about that. What we can do is mitigate. We can start recycling. We can stop putting all the stuff, all the phosphorus that goes into dishwashers, into washing powder, and we can start recycling all human waste, as well as vegetable waste, all human waste, because the phosphorus that goes out of the food system ends up there. And we have to do that. But that's a massive infrastructure change, which we have to deal with. So it's not just about carbon, it's about these finite resources. Similarly, as far as food's concerned, we've got water stress. And there is a strong case that before the climate relevant gases get us, water stress will get us. All of the major food producing regions of the world, North America, California, parts of China, parts of India, water stress. There's water stress measurements. Actually, it's drought. We've got to the point where the depletion of aquifers, through building cities, but also through the use for agricultural use, is beyond the tipping point. There's no way that these aquifers will ever be replenished. And that's through the use of irrigation, through overwater use, and also over-irrigation, which desalinates the soil, which causes salt pollution of the soil. So, climate change, water, and soil, massive soil erosion. Again, you can't see this, but again, all the major grain growing, all the major food producing areas of the world are losing soil at a disastrous rate. Topsoil just disappears. All countries. This slide, which you certainly can't see, because actually the slide is also grey. It's a picture of Beijing on the 13th of March 2011, and there's a person walking. You can barely see him because he's covered, and all the picture is covered by soil, dust, that's been blown from the grain growing areas right into the city. It's just a storm, a blizzard, a wipeout of soil. That's a soil erosion, and this is coming from our agricultural production. We also have it here in this country from a different region, not wind-blown, but waterborne. So all the hills that we have around here, beautiful downs, you plough that up, plough the grassland up, and you have water, and that washes the soil down in gullies and produces massive gullies. It's a big problem in parts of the southeast England. So we have not just climate relevant gases, not just the issue for carbon and carbon equivalents. We've got soil, we've got water, we've got biodiversity depletion, and that's a massive issue. You will have heard about pollinators disappearing, but also microorganisms in the soil are disappearing. And by the disappearance, we don't actually understand what it's doing to the soil web, the integrate relationships that make soil living and soil alive and keep the resilience. Once we start picking things away from this network, from these relationships, we don't know what the consequences are. And we're killing those things off. Again, through overproduction, through misuse of agrochemicals, and through the intensification of our agriculture. So, how do we stop that? How do we sustain civilization? And this is a kind of interesting thing, and I'm using the word civilization advisedly. One thing, the planet actually couldn't care a toss if we disappeared. The Gaia Theory, people talk about Gaia or whatever, but the Gaia Theory basically is the planet's living systems will adapt and they'll carry on. They couldn't care less whether we're here. The planet, Gaia, will continue. What won't continue is our civilization. And in terms of management of finite resources, whether that's energy, whether that's petrochemicals, whatever it is, and particularly whether it's national resources, how we manage these finite resources depends on how we are as a civilization. We can have a state of authoritarianism. We can have a dictatorship by multinational companies, by corporations, by some governments, so that we deal with this in a way that resources are concentrated in the hands of a few people who have a very nice lifestyle. But all of that centralization of resources leads to political and social consequences, which is a massive issue in terms of political stability, in terms of equity, and in terms of the quality of our lives in civilization. So when we're talking about finite resources and how we manage them, we're also talking about, can we sustain a civilized society? So, how do we do it? Where do we start? Personally, and as a society, we've got to try to reconnect with the biological and ecological base of the planet and manage finite resources in that way. We've got to alter all our economic activity around that management, and we've got to conserve and not do things. It's not just enough to deal with efficiency, to have increased efficiency. One of the big arguments about alternatives to agriculture are people saying, okay, if we produce more milk, for example, we use less carbon per litre of milk. We use less greenhouse gases per litre of milk than an extensive farming system because we produce more. So producing more out of finite resources seems to be efficient. It seems to me to beg the question, we shouldn't be using those resources in the first place. So when we start talking about managing finite resources, we need a different definition, a different idea of what efficiency is. Producing more for less doesn't cut it. Producing what we need without those finite resources is what we should be about. So we need to alter how we do things, and we need political action to do that. And in order to have that political action, we've got to stop being consumers. We've got to stop consuming, and we've got to stop having the attitude of being consumers and start having the attitude of being citizens. One of the big problems with everybody who talks about individual choice, companies jump on this bandwagon, and you get the idea, if I consume this because it's got an eco label or a good carbon footprint or a fair trade label or an organic label, then this is okay, I'm doing my bit. It's bollocks. Not at all. We need to stop that change driven by consumerism and have change driven primarily by the idea and citizenship and shared responsibility. And that's the major mental change we have to make. So how do we do this? How do we do this as far as agriculture is concerned and food choices? Industrial agriculture, intensive agriculture, for a range of reasons, not just for climate change, but for things like animal welfare, intensity of production, loss of biodiversity, loss of landscape, a range of issues. The continued model of industrialization doesn't cut it. Neither do, in my view, some system changes whereby we can use better greenhouses, better LED lighting to grow vegetables in super duper greenhouses, or some scale of aquaponics, which we heard about a little bit this morning, because that doesn't really get to the heart of the matter in terms of managing the overall finite resources. It skips, it dodges the issue. And changing the food system is not just about technology, it's also about ownership, it's about access to land, it's about breaking up the corporate model of how we grow food, how we collect it, how we process it, and how we distribute it. Just-in-time technology, which is what our supermarkets are based on, what our processing industry is based on, so also actually what our industry is based on, doesn't work in a world of finite and diminishing resources. Just does not work. We can't do it. We only have maximum 3 days food supply in this country. So the whole Brexit thing is a big problem. Everyone's lying about this. We have 3 days. Because we stopped storing food anywhere in storage facilities, in warehouses or whatever. The food is stored on lorries in transport. That's just-in-time production. And it uses finite resources, uses fossil fuel, uses uses oil, petrochemicals. That's the driver that we have to change. So we have a broken food system. I don't want to go on much longer about this because so we can get some discussion, but the characteristics of what I see as our broken food system is our diet, our food system relies too much on highly processed food and too much on sugars, corn syrup, and processing. So this is an environmentally unhealthy, but also, as I'm sure most of you know, is unhealthy in terms of your diet and your health. We do eat too much meat, no question, and we eat too much meat from industrialized intensive farming. The idea that cows are bad, okay, there's some issues with cows, and pigs and poultry are good, is a nonsense. Pigs and poultry production is highly intensive. There's major problems with animal welfare, there's major problems with antibiotic use, and there is another school of argument that if the climate change doesn't get us, the fact that we're going to run out of antibiotics will get us first. And the intensification of the animal welfare question of that system is a real problem. Too many pesticide residues, we have enough calories, by the way, it's not just a health thing, we have enough calories produced in this world to feed 12 billion plus people. The calories are not going in the right place, they're not in the right area, and they're used for the wrong things. We don't eat enough fruit and vegetables, and we don't eat enough unprocessed, relatively unprocessed. But what does this mean for food choices? The meat versus plant debate is a false conflict. Everyone knows these figures about meat and dairy. 83% of global farmland goes into meat and dairy production. 58% of emissions are used for only 9% or something, 30% of proteins or calories. Says something about the global thing, but nothing about local conditions and local ecologies. It says nothing about the carbon capture, the carbon banks that properly grazed livestock create or use and manage. If we have grassland, 60% of the UK is in grass. If We should certainly alter how we look after and manage those animals, but if we get rid of that, we release a lot of carbon. It says nothing about carbon storage, it says nothing about how to reduce ruminant emissions, it says nothing about biodiversity that goes with those systems, and it says nothing about the animal welfare or the cultural nutrition of what meat production in some communities and some countries mean. And there are some parts of the world who actually have rangeland and grassland. There's no other alternative. If they moved to a different agricultural system, the carbon footprint, the carbon impact would increase. And certainly things like water impact, soil, the impact of soil erosion and so on would also increase. Because there is a problem with vegetable production, and that is most vegetable production is from industrial scale, highly intensive production systems, high use of agrochemicals, a consequent high level of pesticide residues, and greenhouse gas emissions from that fertilization. Water usage in intensive vegetable production is often unsustainable. Spain, just go to southern Spain, have a look at those intensive vegetable production where, I don't know what it is, 30% of our vegetables come from Spain. They get the sun, they don't have the water. That's a real problem. They have to ship water from northern Spain to the south. That's getting worse. Similar problem in California. The water problems in intensive vegetable production manifest. Similarly, soil degradation. And it's not just vegetables, also cereals, also things like soya and other proteins. The intensification of production is the real problem. Meat substitutes that we're developing, kind of vegan stuff, highly processed, involving inputs and things like synthetic biology, technologies which are not being tested at all in terms of food safety. The Impossible Burger, which you've probably heard of, has a substitute of a blood substitute, synthetic biology. It's genetic engineered, not tested. We've got no idea of the health implications of those systems, and again, very, very energy intensive. And all of the system has unsustainable transport and this just-in-time delivery. And all of those intensive systems, whether it's animals or vegetable production, has massive food waste. Intensive vegetable production, whether you're going to have a vegan diet or not a non-vegan diet, food waste takes up 30% of our calorie production. It's gone. A lot of that is in how we produce vegetables and how we deal with them in terms of cosmetics and so on, and the transport system. So what to eat and what to buy, local if possible, so you know what's coming from the system. Grow your own where you can, absolutely. Local sourcing. UK organic, if you can manage it. UK, in many systems, livestock systems, is a lot better than any other part of the world. So UK, if you can manage it. UK organic, if you can manage it. If you can't, low external input systems. Pasture-fed systems for livestock. Some other systems for vegetables and so on. The Waitrose cellar thing, we've got a leaf mark on it. There's questions about that, but nonetheless, it's better than the red tractor. So look at UK production first of all, because we're a lot better than many places. Avoid farmed fish. There's no justification for farmed fish. The idea of buying farmed salmon and pretending this is a healthy thing is just not at all. I mean, farmed salmon is like intensive farm poultry, and massive environmental problems in terms of producing feed and dealing with the waste. So be careful about farmed fish. Wild fish, look for the Marine Stewardship Council logo, although there's problems with it, it's still the best way forward. Fruit is a problem for the UK because we don't have enough of our own. We need a major investment to grow more UK fruit. We need to replant orchards, we need to do better with fruit. In the meantime, we have an issue because most fruit consumed in this country that we bring in and we think are healthy have got very, very high pesticide residue levels. So you want to avoid pesticide residue levels, and some people are not bothered because they think they're safe, and really have to look at that kind of stuff. And organic really is far better than other things. But if you don't bother about pesticide residues, then it's okay. And again, but as close as possible to source, so European rather than flying stuff in from California or wherever else. Balanced diet, clearly. Less meat, more vegetables, but critically, no high processed food. Avoid it. High processed food is bad for your health, and it's certainly bad for the environment. And I've gone way over time, so we don't even have time for questions or whatever.
Yeah,
I
you do.
think. But okay, fine. So that's the simple message. The meat-vegetable conflict is a fake conflict. It's not the case. Not all vegetable production is good. Not all meat production is bad. You need to look at the ecology of all those things. Local and where you know is better and best. Fresh, clearly. Avoid high processing. And don't get obsessed by carbon footprints and carbon offsets and all of that kind of stuff. It's the whole thing. It's the soil use, the water use, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions. And you have to look at that whole system. There are producers doing this, and they need supporting because they're in a hostile economic environment. And even if it costs a little bit more, that's the way to demonstrate that we can do it in this way and build a future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, broke it. Did I break it? No. I think, Lawrence, absolutely right. The sort of the food debate, the transport debate, the housing debate, all of these are really, really important things, but they do all come back to the same message that we said earlier. It is all about consumption. It's about looking at what you do, what you buy, where you buy it from. So I'm sure there's plenty of questions. So because this doesn't go very far, it's not roaming. It's roaming to the end of here. So if anyone's got any questions, you want to step down, step up.
This whole thing about buying UK, things like tomatoes or kiwi fruit, actually, is it true the carbon footprint is higher here because of the heat that's required, as opposed to bringing it in from the Channel Islands or somewhere warmer where they don't have to, they've got more sun?
Yeah, if you're just looking at carbon, if you're just looking at the carbon footprint. We can grow tomatoes here, but they're long season varieties, and they do ripen, but they don't, they don't ripen at the same time, and they don't fit into the food production system. But it's in my view, it's a choice, and you have to look at it. But there's no question as far as carbon is concerned, so long as, and this is a big issue, they're not transported from wherever they're coming from on planes. The aviation fuel thing really does make a big difference. But the other issues in terms of water and soil erosion are not counted into the carbon footprint. And particularly, most tomatoes that are grown in southern Europe are in intensive greenhouse production. They have massive water use, which they have to ship from the north. And that's a real problem. They're not grown in soil, or they're grown in stuff that you wouldn't recognize as soil. And they have high amounts of pesticides and fungicides, particularly because they grow in a monocrop situation, so you get lots of fungal disease. And so there's an increased pesticide residue basis. So it's not easy, but yes, in terms of that. And I don't know about kiwi, I imagine it's the same, but yeah.
Any more? It won't go that far.
Oh, right.
Or it might do, so it's leaning.
Thank you. Yeah, I agreed with many things about the local, and it's just thinking of the average farmer nowadays in this country is about 75 years old person, so it is difficult. I think it's about supporting really local organic production and production farmers, so that people nearby here, Tolhurst Organic, I know that people growing tomatoes very well, so you can still get it, and it's actually diverting your income into someone who who can produce for this country well. So it's where your money goes, that's what you support in the end of the day. Another solution which you didn't mention much, it's hemp. What it can do for carbon is capturing carbon. It's like grass in a way, but like capturing much better than any tree in a way. It's also protein production, which is like per acre is like few times more than any meat. It can produce protein, so it doesn't need any water. So it's also, you can build houses with it. So there's so much about it, and yeah, it is a real answer to me. And here there's a farm nearby in Oxfordshire which growing it, and recently didn't get the license to grow because there's a big legislation problem. So it is where, like, being aware of it and standing on and influencing your MPs. And so yeah, just maybe what was your, because they say talk about farming as well and the food. So what is your thinking about these solutions, and what other solutions do you see in farming?
There is no get out of jail free card with this. Everything to do with ecosystems and how we take things from the ecosystem is swings and roundabouts. So I don't think there's any wonderful way of ticking all the boxes. The issue with cropping and rotation and farms, whatever you build up in soil carbon, in grassland or in break crops, the minute you start cultivating it, that carbon disappears. It goes in, some goes into the soil, some is retained in the soil, but a lot goes off in gases or is leached out of the soil. So farmers who are arguing, okay, grassland farmers or mixed farmers, as Richard Benyon was talking about, that sequestration process only happens in the grassland phase. Once you plough that grassland up, even if you're making a hole in it to plant trees, then you've got greenhouse gases disappearing. And in case there's any kind of growers here who talk about no dig and they think they can use compost and pile compost onto that and deal with it, composting is an organic, a greenhouse gas, a carbon losing process. Inherently, it loses 30% of its weight, and that disappears in carbon and ammonia and in nitrite and so on. This is natural. You know, there's nothing wrong with it. This is a natural process. But let's not pretend it's carbon sequestration. So all cropping has that downside. The way to offset that is by mixtures of cropping, altering the cultivation techniques, and growing the right kind of crops in the rotation. So I think hemp might prove to be a great crop, but it's still, you know, we have to recognize it's still part within that cropping cycle. As peas and beans are, we add nitrogen in and so on. But the minute you move to an exploitative part of the rotation, then you've got those kinds of problems. So it's all swings and roundabouts. In terms of farms and farmers, okay, I don't think current farming structures are fit for purpose. It's not just about CAP or whatever. It's about how the land is owned and managed. I think people have got this romantic idea about mixed farms, but technically, yeah, in theory you can do it, but it's very, very difficult to actually run a mixed farm with all the kind of skills and all the investment that's needed. So if we're going to have those kinds of diverse crop rotations and so on, we need to have a different way of managing land, and that inevitably means a different way of owning land. Similarly, if we want young people onto the land and grow a diversity of crops, they have to have a stake in it. You can't, you know, I mean, I know lots of people who've got big estates and they want somebody, a young person, to come and grow vegetables. Why should they? You know, there's this novel idea about modern peasantry. Jesus Christ, I mean, peasantry, it's hard work. So why would anyone do that on an ongoing basis if they don't have some kind of stake in what they're doing? So that's a big obstacle to getting young people onto the land and starting doing things. And I think the only answer, actually, is socialization of farmland. I think communities ought to own farms. I won't use the word nationalization of farmland because I think there's different ways of having this socialization. But I think communities need to have access whether in partnership with landowners or whether the community buys the land or takes it over. I think the way that we will get the diversity of food supply and cropping and people on the land and food produced at source and processed at source is by communities absolutely getting engaged. And the investment policies to do that, and that means altering the structure and the ownership of our land and land-based industries. Now, I know this would be anathema to lots of people, and I'm not pretending it's easy to do. But, you know, we had this panel discussion, and a guy from the Committee of Climate Change said, if we're dealing with climate change, we need massive transformation of how we do things. And this is one of the kinds of transformations that we need to think about. Leaving it to the market as it is, or the land ownership structures, not just land ownership structures, but also the corporate structures and so on, it's not going to work. We need to change that. We've got to engage people, we've got to connect people, and that means giving everyone a stake in it, in some way. So we need massive change like that.
Come on down. I'll scream it out.
Have you looked at carbon incorporation in the soil as charcoal, as in terra preta?
Colloquially known as biochar. Yeah. I don't see any value in the UK in biochar. I really don't. I know somehow biochar found its way into an acceptable technology in the various panels of climate change. But I don't, and okay, some people swear by it, but I think if you've got good rotations and you're making good compost and stuff like that, I don't see why it's needed for production. In terms of whether biochar is sequestering and holding in the soil more carbon than the long-term diverse grasslands or trees, I'm not really, I think the jury's out on that. I'm not really sure. I wouldn't, yeah. If someone wants to do it, great, but I wouldn't ever recommend any farmer doing it. In terms of a strategy, if we're looking at strategies for taking carbon out of the air, and we do need that because we've got no strategies actually for hitting these zero carbon things without taking carbon out of the atmosphere. If we're looking at strategies for that, then we have to stop farming. And we have to have long-term grassland with extensive grazing, or we have to take land out of production and grow trees. There's no other way to do it. If carbon sequestration, a major carbon sequestration is a strategy. But the first thing is to stop chopping down trees, stop draining land, and stop buying products from where those things are happening. But I think, you know, actual active farming and carbon sequestration doesn't really go together. Goes together, but it's not an answer.
Can I just ask one burning question about Brexit? Because it's burning my head. So obviously, you know, I've kind of grown up hearing about all these farmer subsidies, farmers get paid all this money, they get this, that and the other. So obviously with the potential at some point, maybe, leaving of the EU, is that going to have, in your opinion, a massively negative effect? Are we suddenly going to have to, you know, make more land available to, you know, increase that? You're saying 3 days worth of food production's knocking around in Arctic trucks, etc., in storage. What impact will Brexit have not only on our food supply, but then obviously the impact on the environment if then things step up 10 or 15 notches into sort of mass farming or you know, trying to be more sustainable as a country?
Unless there's some secret bunkers somewhere or some information or report that the government hasn't made available, if we leave without a deal, without a transition period, we immediately face tariff barriers on food imports to this country. Something like, I don't know what it is, 60, 70% of our food comes from Europe or through European ports. We will have, again, I say, unless there's some magic one somewhere that I haven't been told about, we will have an immediate impact, a massive impact, in terms of importation of food in the event of a no-deal collapse. We have a transition period of several years. then those things can be dealt with, as long as there's proper arrangements. So that import-export thing can be dealt with. In terms of changes to the CAP, the government's made a commitment that current levels of payment to farmers will be kept in place, paid for by a UK taxpayer, will be kept in place for the period of the transition. So they're expecting that to be, they were expecting that to be 2022, I think. So that's in place. Nobody knows what's going to happen after that. The economics of farmers are that something like 70-75% of UK farmers rely on subsidies. Now you can dress these up. You can dress these up as environmental payments, payments for public goods. You can tart them up any way you like. But essentially, the UK taxpayer or the European taxpayer are paying for farmers and are supporting those businesses. There is no way under current economic conditions that those farms will be viable without that level of support. Now, I would not trust this government, a coalition government, or any government, Labour government or whatever, in any commitment to maintaining those levels of support. We can't do it. The Exchequer can't do it. And actually, there is a question about whether taxpayers ought to be paying for that anyway. Because those levels of subsidy give inflated land values. And those inflated land values are one of the reasons people can't afford to buy land to get into farming. It's your question in the first place. So that economic structure has to change dramatically. And nobody in agriculture, well, very few people are facing up to it. So we get this bollocks about public payment, public money for public goods. And the farmers are convincing themselves that those levels of subsidy are going to be transferred to those payments, those environmental payments. Not a chance. I mean, would you trust them to do it? I certainly don't trust them to do it. And whether it's right that they do. So we have to, again, start looking at the whole structure of support for agriculture, and we have to look at what the taxpayer wants. Now, I think the taxpayer has got no idea about this, and has got no idea what farmers deliver in terms of landscape, and what proper good farming can deliver in terms of biodiversity, and all these other environmental goods and services. They have no idea about that. I fear that if the taxpayer was asked to say how much of their taxes they would like to go into that kind of stuff, that most people wouldn't particularly want to spend a lot of their money on that. And that is the task in terms of whatever we want to do about climate change or managing finite resources, it's convincing people that we as citizens have got to pay for it. It's not just farming, it's everything to do with management of finite resources. We have to pay for it. So we've got an education job to do. Crashing out of Brexit will be a disaster because we will not be able to have these conversations. If we don't crash out, maybe we have these conversations, but who knows. But the structure of farming in the UK cannot continue. Structure of farming in Germany, for example, is completely different. There's a mixture of high level of state payments to farmers, a high level of connection between people within the state and the farming communities, and a willingness of the taxpayer to pay farmers for local goods and services. And there's a real connection between direct sales and organic farmers particularly in Germany, with their consumers and in terms of delivery of wildlife, biodiversity and so on. So yeah, we need to move towards that situation.
Thank you very much. I think the takeaways I've taken from this, it's similar, I think, probably to every conversation you'll hear today, which is support local, buy local, look up what you're buying, where you're buying it from, stop over-consuming. As you rightly said, everything's got a stamp or a badge or a label on it that's trying to convince you that it's the right thing to buy for the right reason. Most of those are paid for. I work with a great cooperative. We import some olive oil from Greece, and they come from organic farms, but they can't say it's organic because that costs quite a lot of money to get that stamp. So, very grateful for the work that people like Lawrence are doing. And, let's be aware there is a big political agenda that's going on at the moment, and that will rapidly change what we eat, where it comes from. So, can we join and say thank you very much? I think the next one's on the list.